Today we visit one of the best known stories in the New Testament, and it is in fact one of the most often quoted in one form or another. We talk about people seeing the light or being blinded by the light, or people having their Damascus Road moment, this epiphany, this illumination. And Luke actually tells the story of Paul's conversion 3 times in the book of Acts, reflecting how important this story was for the early church. But it's the first one, this one that is our reading today, that people know best. And reading it again, I was so deeply moved by it. In fact, I was taken aback by how moved I was by reading the story again. And I know I use this word a lot in my preaching, and if I don't do it every week, I certainly in church will use the word somewhere. But let me use it again today, and I want to simply say that this story of Saul's conversion is truly a beautiful story. We often read only the first 9 verses, or maybe the first 19 verses. That's the bright light, the falling off the horse, the voice, and the blindness, and so on. That's a very dramatic story, and rightly so. But when you read the whole thing, when you go up to verse 31, as we have today, it then becomes a beautiful story, not just a dramatic story, but a beautiful story. And so I wanted today to see if we could consider 3 moments of beauty in the story and see if those moments could be helpful for us. The first observation I wanted to make is those who are forgiven much, love much. Those who are forgiven much, love much. The person that God chooses to be his greatest advocate across the world is not one of the people that Jesus discipled, not one of the people that Jesus taught, not one of the people who walked with Jesus. Instead, God chooses what really is his greatest enemy, or if you like, if you want to be more precise, the church's greatest enemy. But for Luke, those are the same thing. If you were against God's people, you were against God. And we cannot know why God chose Paul and not someone else. But we are reminded in the choosing of Paul that none of us is saved by our own choosing. All of us are saved not by our own doing, but always and only by God's initiative. And so you and I are here today, even watching online, anything that draws you to this, it's not really by your own choosing, even if you picked up your own phone or tuned into your own TV on YouTube. You have not primarily done that by your own choosing. You do it because somehow God has first sought you out. But moving on, God may have chosen Saul because of his remarkable intellect. We can guess about these things. Maybe it was his remarkable intellect. Saul stands quite easily in human history. He stands quite easily alongside the ancient philosophers like Socrates or Plato. And so perhaps God chose Saul knowing that with his scholarly background in Israel's history, his writings and leadership would create a theology which could feed the church for thousands of years as it has done. Perhaps that was why God did it. Or perhaps God chose Saul because through his vociferous persecutions of the early church, he had proven himself to be, if nothing else, a man of great passion. And God knew that such passion, harnessed for the kingdom of God, could change the world. Perhaps that's why. And in truth, God's reason for choosing Paul is of no consequence, and according to the scriptures, is none of our business. All that matters, though, is that God did choose this man, Paul. And Paul's life reminds us, or reminds me, so much of what I think is one of the gospel's magnificent stories. Can I remind you of it? There was a woman who had lived a particularly sinful life, and she heard that Jesus was in town, and so she gate-crashed a dinner party that Jesus was attending. And when she gets into the room, she falls at the feet of Jesus, and she weeps. And as she weeps, she wipes her tears away with her hair. And then she kisses the feet of Jesus. And then she anoints the feet of Jesus with perfume. And it's all very intense. And in fact, when you read it, it might even feel a little inappropriate, uncomfortable, observing this extravagant expression of emotion. And the hosts and other guests who are present are appalled at this extravagant behavior from a woman with this particular reputation. But Jesus defends the woman by challenging the host. He says to the host, when I arrived today, you never even brought out the traditional water for foot washing. You never greeted me with the customary kiss. But she, on the other hand, has lavished love on me. And then Jesus says from Luke's Gospel, I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. And so, as we know, Paul described himself as the chief of sinners, and he never lost, despite all that he did and all that he was a part of, he never lost that sense of himself, that he knew who he was. He understood the capacity that had been within him as a person before he had met Christ. Some of you will know Chris Christopherson's deceptive masterpiece. I call it deceptive because it could easily be misunderstood to just be a piece of hokey country music. That song, Why Me, Lord? But in that song, Chris makes the simple yet utterly profound confession. I don't know that he would have had any idea of how profound this confession was, but in that song he makes this profound confession, and he simply sings, I know what I am. I know what I am. And the beginning of our love for God is the realization that I know what I am. And yet, despite being that, God loves me, God embraces me, God defends me as Jesus did the woman, and God forgives me. And Paul preached the gospel into the rest of his days, as we know. Paul preached the gospel with the same passion as a dinner party, gate-crashing woman who wanted to fall at the feet of Jesus. Because those who are forgiven much love much. I wonder what that might say for some of us today. The second moment of beauty that I wanted to highlight, if I may, is that to be converted, we often speak about this story as being Paul's conversion, but to be converted, amongst whatever else it may mean, certainly means to be awakened to our humanity. To be converted is to be awoken to our humanity. As you know, Sharon and I care a great deal about the work of the Karoo Donkey Sanctuary. And for months now, they've been caught up in a land dispute, not of their own making. And recently it came to light that other parties in this dispute have maliciously destroyed the shelters for the donkeys and horses, which has then ended up exposing them to the frigid Karoo winter temperatures. And so different rescue operations are currently underway to try and protect as many of those horses and donkeys as possible. But the reason I just quickly touch on that is because one of the burning questions of the week for me has been, what is it in the soul of a person that allows them to be so deliberately cruel? The destroying of those shelters didn't have to happen. It wasn't necessary. But to do it, what makes you, what is it in your heart that allows you to be so deliberately cruel? And cruelty is not a situational thing. It's not there just for a moment or in a certain circumstance. Cruelty is a condition of the soul. And if you can be cruel to a donkey, I tell you, you can be cruel to anything or anyone. Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, wrote of man's inhumanity to man. And it doesn't take much to notice the cruelty that surrounds us in our world today. Cruelty is not exclusively a condition belonging to the people in the land dispute in the Karoo. And I mentioned cruelty because cruelty was a mark of Saul's life before he met Jesus. Cruelty engendered his ideological and national and religious passions. In other words, Saul saw Jesus and his followers as a threat to the Israel he believed in, and to the destiny of the Israel he believed in. And that threat justified in his mind any measure of cruelty he desired. And again, without getting distracted or repeating myself week after week, we are witnesses of that kind of terrible cruelty in our world today, motivated by the very same things that motivated Paul. Ideological, national, and religious passions. It's amazing how history repeats itself. Luke describes Saul not just as imprisoning people, but he uses the phrase of Saul as having done terrible things. So there was a definite mark of bad English, but terribleness to Saul's life. And then into that cruelty, beauty comes. Under God's direction, a man named Ananias, frightened by the prospect of engaging this man with this terrible reputation, goes to the home of another guy called Judas, not the famous one, and he prays for Saul under God's instruction. He prays for Saul. And in that moment, Ananias offers Saul the grace that Saul had denied to so many people. And then that is part of the transformation for Saul, and we'll talk about that in a moment or a little later. But Saul then begins preaching within days of that prayer from Ananias, and within days of having joined the Christian community, he becomes a preacher almost instantaneously. And each day, as he finds his feet in this new way of living, his preaching becomes more and more powerful, we are told. And God had warned Saul that following the way of Jesus would not be a life of moonlight and roses, but instead for Saul to follow the way of Jesus, for him it would be a path of suffering. And so quite soon, in response to Saul's preaching, a group of people who were much like Saul had been, they set out to kill him for similar reasons that Saul had wanted to kill people. And into that, another moment of beauty emerges. For this still relatively unknown man, who had been in this community only for a matter of days, the Damascus Christians gather around him, and they come up with a plan to smuggle Saul out of the city to save his life and to help him off to Jerusalem, where they think he'll be safer. And I ask you just to pause for a moment with that thought. Imagine all the undercover planning that needed to happen. You had to be careful. This is kind of like a spy operation. Think of those who volunteered to make the trip to Jerusalem with Saul, to keep him company, to leave home and go down and be with him and run the risk of being found out as they traveled. Think of those who were risking arrest or mob justice from those who were seeking to kill Saul if they found out these were the helpers, what they might have done to them. And they were doing all of this for the sake of saving a man who just weeks before would have been delighted to see any of them dead. To quote the famous phrase, it makes me cry out, oh, the humanity, or at least, oh, the beauty of it all. The Christian faith has so often been marked with an inhumanity, all of its own. Alongside the other inhumanities that fill our world, the Christian church has been filled with the inhumanities of its own, the vitriol and suspicion that we have often created around people who do not believe as we do, whether they be Muslims or Jews or Catholics or Jehovah's Witnesses or the lady who sells crystals at the flea market. We have often denied people the dignity and their right to believe. The unforgivable harm, and I speak about this enough, I know, but the unforgivable harm we have caused gay people, the shaming we have enacted against people struggling with sexuality and gender issues. The list of our inhumanity as the people of God is long, tragically long. But we must know this today, that when Jesus gets a hold of us, when his presence and his light knock us to the ground, his call upon our life is not to a life of condemning a different set of people and standing above or over people who are different from us. When Jesus gets a hold of us, he awakens within us a deep humanity, the humanity that saves a man who was once your enemy. It is worth our while to reflect on the state of our own humanity. How are we doing when it comes to being human, fully human in our world? And then the final observation, the final moment of beauty in our story is, let me title it by observing that we are hurt in community and therefore we are healed in community. We are hurt in community and we are therefore healed in community. I think perhaps the most notable part of the story is how Saul's conversion is not a private affair. It's not just a Jesus and me moment. It's not between him and God alone. When Saul is blinded by the light, those who are accompanying him take him to a house in Straight Street. That street still exists today, by the way. But they walk him there, and I imagine they're not sure what to do with him. And then God sends Ananias to pray for him at Straight Street. And we know, just from the stories, this story, we know that God could have healed Saul without Ananias' intervention. God could have just made the scales fall from his eyes and allowed him to see again. But that's not how God works. It's interesting, it's sometimes frustrating, but we know for certain that that's not how God works. We are hurt in community, and we are to be healed in community. And it's not just the Ananias moment, it is the Damascus community which helps Saul, I keep mixing that up, we'll talk about his name change another time, but which helps Saul escape to Jerusalem. It's that Damascus faith community which rallies together, as we've spoken of, to help him escape. And then when Saul gets to Jerusalem, it's the people, the Christian people, including the apostles, who are still afraid of Saul. And so when he arrives, they're terrified. And then it takes a guy called Barnabas, who we have heard a little of before, but it takes a guy called Barnabas to mediate that and to help Saul integrate into this Christian community now in Jerusalem. So Saul doesn't just have this massive moment, this unique moment in the Christian story, and they just go, I'm God's person, I've met Jesus face to face, I'm going to go off and do my own thing. There's none of that. The way God works is Saul gets integrated into a community, and in a sense he finds his feet, he learns the ropes, he is shaped and formed by his belonging to the community. And so it's an old saying, but let me repeat it: when we accept Jesus into our lives, his friends come with him. You don't get Jesus without his friends. We don't get to deal with Jesus. We don't get to have a relationship with Jesus without dealing with his friends. And it is mostly through Jesus' friends, through the friends of Jesus, that we will learn to become more like Jesus. I think that's why Jesus puts us all together, is because that's how we learn to become like him. Many of you will know that well-known proverb, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. God puts us together so that together we can go through all the challenges of human relationship and learn every time to become more and more like him. Without Ananias, without the beautiful, brave people of Damascus, without Barnabas, without the apostles, without the other believers in Jerusalem, Saul may have remained just a blind man in Straight Street. Never, ever underestimate that this is the Jesus way, that we are shaped and converted in community, as hard as that sometimes might be. So I leave you with this blessing today. May your life be marked by the beauty of the gospel, which transformed the life of the persecutor Paul. Go in peace. Amen.